The village of Burston is just north of Dis on the main line to Norwich, but trains don't stop there anymore. Yet there was a time, some 60 years ago, when Burston Village Green was a place of pilgrimage for British Labour people, showing solidarity with, of all things, the children of the village school. In this tranquil corner of Norfolk in the spring of 1914, just before the First World War, the local school children took the most drastic action in a spontaneous act of love. They came out on strike because their teachers had been sacked. It was famous enough to become news. A village schoolroom strike in 1914. How could it have come about? Yet it was a strike that was to go on for more than 20 years. It all began in the simplest way. The children of Burston loved their schoolmistress and schoolmaster and didn't want them to be unjustly fired. They probably didn't understand the politics of it all, but the political resonance was heard all over the country. They must have been a truly remarkable couple. Annie Higden, a certified teacher, and her husband Tom Higden, who was her assistant, deeply principled, old-fashioned socialists who'd had the council school at Burston for 3 years before they ran into trouble. There had been a prologue, of course. They had worked before in another school under the same Norfolk Education Committee a bit further north. This was in a village called Wood Darling, some 70 years ago. Wood Darling was a straggling little place in poor farming country where life was all right for the landowners but not for anyone else. There the husband and wife team of the Higdens ran a typical late Victorian country school, the classroom part of which was long ago swallowed up as a storage shed and the house made part of a farm. Some people still remember being taught by the Higdens all those years ago at the turn of the century. In those days, Ted Williams was a very little boy.
I believe I came to school when I was 4 and a half at this school, but Mr. Higden, as far as I remember or know, he didn't come here until 1902. Well, that left me about 7, you see. Mrs. Higden used to teach at this end of the school, and Mr. Higden, her desk was there, Mr. Higden's desk was there. Taught that end of the school.
There must have been about 90 children at the Wood Darling School then, the older ones all together in this one room with Annie and Tom Higden.
Well, they'd have prayers, then generally tables. We come into school at 9 o'clock in the morning.
In the door would come Mr. and Mrs. Higden. We should all be in our seats by then, and we'd have to salute, stand up, salute, and say, "Good morning, governors, good morning, sir." They would reply, "Good morning, children." Go straight to the desks, and Mr. Higden would open the register. He'd then call the register, starting from the top to the bottom of the classes. And all of those that were there at the time would get a red mark. If they came after he closed the register, they got a black one.
But Sidney Payne got no black marks because Sidney Payne was never late, and indeed never absent. Attendance and punctuality were valued in those days, and conscientiously Mrs. Higden set it all down in the logbook. She was strict, but she was very gentle, and her children remembered that. Farm workers' children for the most part, and very, very poor. Some were a bit better off, like Ted Williams, a farmer's son.
I thought Mrs. Higden was a very kind woman. She really kind, and the poor children in the school, she tried her hardest to get them something, a little extra, to what they'd had at home.
There's 11 of us. We didn't see the things like we see today, though. We lived sort of with potatoes and just ordinary food. Well, I didn't have the wages because my father only earned 12 shillings a week.
Jessie Springle remembers especially how Mrs. Higden helped the girls with practical things like cooking, things that had meaning in poor farm workers' homes. Mrs. Higden didn't think all education was in books.
She learnt us how to make all clothes and things, and knitting. That's what was very good of her, because we used to go round and the people, and they were glad to buy them, you see. So you got them cheaper.
1903, 17th of March. Children taken for a ramble. One of them was Tom Barnes.
She used to take us on these here do's, and always used to give us scrambles with sweets and that, you know. And if we done anything outside the school and she got the hair of it, she was very annoyed, she was. She always used to punish us.
And I remember if you didn't behave yourselves, you're going to stand on the stool in front of the class with your hands on your head.
But the Higdens were even sterner with the farmers when they found their pupils being illegally kept from school to work in the fields. There was one day when Tom Higden looked from the schoolroom window and he saw one of his regular truants having to work the land. Everyone remembered that day.
His name was Albert Cotterell, and on this very field in front of the school here, he was what we should call in Norfolk, leading the horse in the drill, the front horse. And Mr. Higden knew well enough he should be at school.
And he sent a note asking the boy, or the farmer to send the boy to school, and nothing happened. And I think he sent another note. I hate all this, you see, and still nothing happened. And then Tom went after him, and
he gave the farmer a black eye, see, and of course he went to court and he had to pay.
Tom Higden was fined 40 shillings and costs. It was only one of so many conflicts the Higdens were to have with the local society. Annie and Tom Higden had their own rules, but all their unorthodoxy was motivated by one thing: what was best for the children. And in fact, it was best for the children. The government inspectors gave them wonderful notices saying the Higdens were energetic and industrious teachers. Two of their old pupils were George and Hetty Ransom.
She was a splendid teacher for sort of singing and that sort of thing, sewing class and that sort of thing. I remember the French lady came there to stay, and she taught Forever with the Lord, and all I can remember was the first verse. La vida victoire que désirer mon cœur, je le demande pour tel well nom ne manque souvent. Well, we used to say mong, and we used to have to say, no, that isn't right, this French lady used to say, that's mong. You had to sort of pronounce it like that. And we had that over and over again to get it right.
Once she tried to teach us French, but rather she got in a muddle with the managers and they cut that out.
The managers wanted to cut everything out of school but the 3 R's. It's hard to remember now how such a short time ago these rural communities were ruled by a combination of patronage and privilege that was pretty nearly feudal even then. The school managers were appointed by the Education Committee from the little circle of local bourgeoisie, the Petit Squierarchy and the Parsonage. It wasn't an establishment that would take kindly to the uncompromising consciences of a Mr. and Mrs. Higden, who interpreted education literally as meaning not to cram in but to lead forth, which in those days meant socialism. It was inevitable that the Higdens were on a collision course with authority. Annie Higden was forever writing to the managers, drawing attention to something or other in the classrooms: smoking chimneys, smelly drains, damp walls. It did not increase her popularity, except, of course, with the children.
She would want to have a good fire the winter time, because some of us would be practically wet through by the time we got there. And there used to be a huge round guard right round the fire, and that used to be full of clothes drying off. You see, she used to stir the managers up, and of course they used to get so annoyed with her because she used to want more coal.
Oh, they used to kick up a lot of fuss about that. They used to. An awful lot of fuss. And of course that's why they got turned out of Wooddown School. She called one of the managers a lie, you know, and she wouldn't apologise.
I think one thing led to another, and then I think there was with her husband, there was a bit of political part attached to it as well, because he was a man always, you know, stuck up for the agricultural workers a lot. Well, of course, that didn't all managers, they were nearly all farmers, of course, that didn't suit them.
He hated the farmers. Mr. Higden hated the farmers. He was right against them.
The fact is, to be sure, that Tom Higden was an intensely political man. He'd been working for the new local farm labourers' union, arguing that they were a very exploited community, as they were. He'd also become chairman of the parish council, replacing a local farmer who was chairman of the school managers. Tom Higden really got their old bourgeois backs up, and they made a united front to get rid of them both. They put in formal complaints to the Norfolk Education Committee on all manner of grounds, from Annie Higden using too much coal to general bloody-mindedness. And the result was that Mrs. Higden was told to resign and take her troublesome husband with her. So they left Wood Darling. Before they went away, Mrs. Higden signed off the school log with a few comments of her own that the Education Committee saw fit to censor from the record. The curious thing is that the Norfolk authorities did not rid themselves of the Higdens' consciences, but passed them on to another school that was going to become a small part of English history. On the 31st of January 1911, the Higdens arrived in the village of Burston and moved straight into the council school with 70 or 80 pupils, mostly the children of the farm workers all around. They are well remembered, especially by a woman who was a 10-year-old girl then, Violet Potter.
We thought they were the best teachers that we'd ever had. You know, they were so kind and so talkative to us, not like the teachers we'd had before, because I remember about 7 different teachers in that school. And they were all right as teachers, but they hadn't got the personality that Mr. and Mrs. Higden had, especially Mrs. Higden. She was one of the best. Wonderful things she did, you know, for the people and the children. If they came to school with poor boots and they took water, she'd buy them a new pair, all out of her own pocket.
Most of the pupils of that Burston school of 2 generations ago seem to have fallen under Mrs. Higden's spell. One was Marjorie Ling.
She used to take the children out in the country, around the fields, and we used to get all sorts of things and bring them home and draw them and things like that, you know.
She taught us typewriting. She had an old-fashioned typewriter, probably you wouldn't recognise it today, an old Oliver. And she brought that to school. That was her own. Taught some of us bigger children to use that.
School hours didn't seem to mean anything to Annie Higden. She'd teach as long as anyone wanted to learn.
We'd meet up the schoolhouse, 5 or 6 of us elder children, and go out into the playground, and she'd explain the Mars and Jupiter, and she studied the stars, and then we had to write about that the next day. I know I went once or twice, and we always used to get a cup of cocoa and a bun before we came home. So, yes, she did that, and a lot of different things that we didn't have when we had the other teachers. But still, it was all education, wasn't it?
Then, as now, Burston village was farming country. Working conditions were pretty awful. Housing was miserable. A farm worker's pay was about 12 bob a week. May Wilby remembers it all.
Mr. Higden was all for the Labourers' Union, and he came here and found there was nothing like that going on, and he started his work in that way, which I believe he had already started at Wood Darling, where he came from.
When we had the union here, we used to meet at the meetings, so we did congregate a bit more with the Higdens being here.
Arthur Moore was a young farmhand then, and he remembers the real climax of that time, which was when Tom Higden and some of the agricultural workers dared to put themselves up as candidates for the parish council election in 1913. And not only that, but had the impertinence to romp home as workers and got a majority, with Tom Higden top of the poll.
And at the meeting, you see, some labourers went on, and Mr. Higden all went on, and the farmers, they were dissatisfied. They demanded the poll straight away. But then most of the labourers got on. I think it was 5 got on. There was only 2 of their side.
The real body blow was that the local parson wasn't even elected. The Reverend Charles Tucker Eland felt that was a sort of heresy. The parson was always elected by divine right. and the Reverend Eland was a school manager, so was his wife. This was the way things were supposed to be in the villages of those days. Anything else was Red Revolution. The backlash took the same form as at the previous school.
Well, we were not supposed to have a fire until a certain date, and she took it upon herself to have fires lit. I think there was a fire at each end of the school, and dry the children's clothes so that they shouldn't have to go home with wet coats.
And that's what the parson in the village didn't like. He said that she was wasting the coal to dry the children's clothes, you see, and other things as well. And things piled up, and of course he did it his business to try and get them out.
Now the Higdens were under siege. From the landowners because Tom Higden was a union man, from the church because the Higdens were radicals and wouldn't even go to church. It was a formidable opposition. It was said that Mrs. Higden lit fires in the school without asking permission, that she'd been uncivil to the parson's wife, and, more importantly, that she had beaten 2 Bernardo girls under the care of a woman in the village. If this were true, it were very serious.
And the children themselves told us that they were told to say it. It didn't happen at all. They were told to say that. And I suppose the poor little children were afraid otherwise, because I don't think she was a very good foster mother. I think she was very, very strict, and they did as she told them. And the rector put her up to this. I suppose she was afraid of losing the children, losing the money, because she got so much money for them.
Most of the village was on the Higden side by now, and almost everyone believed, although it couldn't be proved, that this charge about the foster children was quite bogus.
I think that was just a little plot made up to get rid of them. The real reason why they got the sack was they were Labour people.
Because he was trying to organise a labourers' union.
Another pupil, Barney Ford.
He was doing his utmost to make things better for the farm worker, who were on very low wages at that time.
Starting the labourers' union, trying to improve the conditions, footpaths round the village, and toilets and different things for the poor old people who lived in these old houses belonging to the farms. They were poor old places then, and that was the real reason.
The village believed in the Higdens, but there weren't many friends outside. The National Union of Teachers found it hard to believe that people would deliberately plot against a couple of eccentric school teachers, and defended them very half-heartedly. There was a tribunal, and it went against them. The Higdens went to the children.
The schoolmistress said that, no, children, she said, we are not allowed to teach you anymore in this school.
When we got home, we heard what our parents said. They said, yes, we're not going to let this rest. And we had a meeting on the green, and Mr. Durbridge was chairman.
George Durbridge was a local character with a fine sense of rhetoric. Sol Sandy was there.
At the meeting they sent a resolution, I believe, to those the Commons, and Mr. Durbridge said, stick like bloody shit to a blanket.
The parents were solid behind the Higdens, and so were the children. Violet Potter was 13 when she became the children's leader.
Well, I said to them, we want to know who's going out on strike and who isn't. Well, all but about 6 said that they would come out. I think it was about 72 children went to school then. And I put the names down on a sheet of paper that I'd got already. And that night when Mr. and Mrs. Higden finished up, we stayed behind and helped to, Marjorie and I did, help to take her possessions indoors, because she'd got her sewing machine and her camera and her typewriter and a lot of personal belongings in the school, in the council school, and we took them into the schoolhouse. We slipped back into the school, and I turned the blackboard up. We had blackboard and chalk. We're going on strike tomorrow, and turned it to the wall, so that the teachers that came the next day, the new teachers, when they came to use this blackboard, that's what they would see.
Next day, April the 1st, 1914, was the big moment of action.
We all collected on the green at the bottom, watched to see who went to the council school, and all we thought they'd come with us, and some that we expected to come with us didn't. But I think there was about 8 or 9 probably went to the council school, and the rest of us all came on strike. And we all had pieces of cardboard, probably bits of boot box or something like that, wrote on, we want our teachers back, we want justice. And I think Violet Potter and Jack Mullinger, another striker, had an accordion and walked round the village like that.
And as we walked past the school teacher, the mistress and the master was standing outside the school, and she waved a handkerchief to us and waved. I could see that she was crying.
And either 3 or 4, I couldn't tell you which, one was a police sergeant, stood by, and 1 or 2 of the church wardens. They'd evidently got an inkling that something was going to happen. And of course we went by singing, and me with a piano chord and playing Hearts of Oak. That was our song.
Well, we just trotted along with the rest, more or less. There was quite a procession. I remember it. That's something we never forgot. But the main thing is we knew from our parents that we were doing something what was just. That's how we all felt about it. I think every child understood there was a big reason, big cause.
We sat all round on the green, and the woman at the village shop, she brought out pails of lemonade for us to drink. And we were very, very hot. I always remember that 1st of April.
From that 1st of April, the records show that hardly a handful of Burston children were going to the council school. The children's strike was almost 100%. Violet Potter and the others urged on the campaign. By now, Annie Higden and Tom had become folk heroes of Burston, more famous every day. The daily marches and demonstrations of the militant children were now led by equally militant parents.
We marched past the vicarage one day, and this woman that was head of the strike, she said, "Here he is," and he came and wondered what all the banging was about, you see. And he came to his gates, iron gates, and looked through. "Here he is," she said, "the little devil."
I think they used to call him the Black Beetle.
We kept it up for some time until we had to start having lessons because we're getting round for non-attendance at school, you see.
The Higdens gave up their school, but they didn't give up their vocation. Every day they held their classes in the open air on Burston Green. The parents demanded the Higdens' reinstatement, but then in came the law. A group of parents were summoned for not sending their children to the official school.
Well, we formed a procession and marched to this, and we had buttonholes, red buttonholes. We all marched to court.
We went to the court, and the court was packed, and we couldn't get in. Then after, they called Mr. Aldridge in first.
Oh, they called my name first.
Old Jack Aldrich was one of 18 parents fined that day. The courtroom became another platform for their cause. They weren't kept there very long.
I didn't last many minutes. You see, I think I fined them about, I don't know, about 5 shillings each.
Some of the boys had got collecting tins. We collected all the money that was... So you could see a lot of people were in sympathy with us. Collected the fines.
A few weeks later, more parents were brought to court. But it was obviously hopeless, and by the authorities just gave up. Funds were opened for the strikers all over the place. And then someone offered the Higdens an old carpenter's shop in Burston that they could use as their own school.
Very big place it was. Well, held all us anyway. There was a ladder, went upstairs. The seniors were taught upstairs, but the little tots were not allowed to go up that ladder. They always put in the mind of going up aboard a ship or something or other. But it was rough in there, but Mrs. Higden made it very, very comfortable for the children.
We had a timetable like we had in the council school. Everything was worked doing out time, starting from 9, religious scriptures, and then 10, arithmetic, and 11, playtime, which, because we had to use the green for playground. The inspectors came down 2 or 3 times to see if they could find any fault with the education. They couldn't find a bit of fault. I think, if I remember it, the report was the reading and writing is well above the average, and religion is taught on sensible lines.
By now, naturally, a few children had started drifting back from the strike school to the council school for various reasons: anxiety, conformism, pressure, but not very many. When the 5 children of Jack Aldrich's family had to move to another village, the Higden faction had a quick answer.
I bought them a donkey's cart and I used to ride in that.
So Jack Aldrich's children were able to stay on at school, riding with Charles and Elsie at the reins.
And so they made up their mind, and out of the collection they bought this donkey cart for us.
And the roadmen working on the sides of the road, they used to tickle under the Tommy with a stiff broom to make it run, and then if it came to a stream of water running across the road, that'd pull up dead and we'd have to get out and lead it through. It wouldn't go through it.
So not only did the Aldrich children get to class, but this makeshift carpenter's shop school was helped by the arrival in Burston of strike supporters like the family of Wyn Leader from Ipswich.
My father worked on the railway line and worked quite a lot in the Burston area. And when the school strike started, he was the first one, so Mrs. Higden told me, who made a collection for the strike. Well, then eventually we went to Burston to live, and of course as soon as we lived there, I went to school. He wouldn't have thought of me going anywhere else.
By now, everyone seemed to be paying attention to Burston village and the obstinate, abrasive, dedicated and unyielding Higdens. The feelings against the parson, the Reverend Eland, had practically emptied his church, and religious services were now held in the open air by lay preachers and political radicals of all kinds.
There always seemed to be something doing, some excitement. Of course, we had hundreds and hundreds of people came there to visit the school, to speak on the village green, and it was tremendous support.
The Agricultural Labourers' Union regularly turned up at Burston, often with its leader, George Edwards. Tom Higden was now committed to the union as its treasurer. This famous village green had visits from all the old socialist notables like Ben Tillett, the miners' leader, Tom Mann, the Labour pioneer, George Lansbury, the great pacifist, Philip Snowden, one day to be the Labour Chancellor, and from the great suffragette family, Sylvia Pankhurst. Burston Village Green became a kind of focal point of the English left.
Well, one Sunday we had a special train load of National Union Railway men from London.
They had these big banners, huge banners, and beautiful coloured silks, and all the gold tassels, and it took a couple of men each side to carry these big banners, come off the station and march through the village.
Well, they came to the green, and we had a big meeting there then, and the Reverend Eland, he daren't come down the road to church. I suppose he thought they might set about him. He came by the footpaths and got through a gap in the hedge. Just to, because you see, you have to have a service, even if you, I think if you've got 3, you must have a service. And he just had 3 or 4 of his church wardens, and that's all.
Marjorie Ling's father was one of those who'd boycotted the church and supported the strike. But the Ling family had rented church land for generations, which meant he could be evicted.
The schoolmistress said, well, Mr. Ling, she said, put your chickens on there, claim it. Put your chickens on there. It is your land. And he put these chickens up and surrounded by the bar netting and things like that. And someone came and bashed it all down.
Another family, the Garnhams, had always grown their crops on glebe land rented from the church.
The parson tried to take this land away from them. And so we went at night and in the moonlight cut the corn and tied it up and all what's necessary, you know, and saved his harvest.
The Burston strike divided friends, split even families into factions, with a very small minority trying to protect themselves by staying on the Parsonage side. It happened to the Lings.
One day my cousin came up from the bottom of the field with a pitchfork, and he was running up the side of the field, and my married sister was at home then, and she showed, we were all standing, my father and I and my sister were standing in the field, and my cousin was running up the pitchfork, and he certainly would have put it through my father. If my sister hadn't said, look, he's running up the... It was vicious all the time.
By now, the First World War meant that Burston had few young men left to fight the battle of the church tenants. Yet even at this tormenting time, the Burston school strike and the evictions had become a national issue, and meetings were held in London to raise funds. The labour movement seemed to find its symbol in this East Anglian village, and funds came in every morning from everywhere to the school on Burston Green.
Some of the bigger girls, she said, now you can open the mail. Well, there would be paper knives splitting up in these, open these, and, oh, I got a cheque for £5. I got a cheque for £20. And we used to be so pleased to think that was one got more than the other, you know, you might be sure. And I tell you, there was one was only half a crown. I think I opened that, I'm not sure, but it was from an old age pension house. I'll never forget that. Because I said, well, whatever good is half a crown? Mrs. Higden said, every little helps.
And so, at last, Mr. and Mrs. Tom Higden's gesture of independence achieved a real and solid form. A brand new, visible and tangible strike school, all of their own. An actual building created out of money subscribed by supporters everywhere, who may never have clapped eyes on Burston, but who knew what it meant. On Sunday, May the 13th, 1917, while the Great War raged in Flanders, the strike school at Burston, Norfolk, was formally opened by its leading pupil, Violet Potter.
The green was crowded so much you couldn't see over the top of people's heads. I don't know how many people, and all lined up by the sides of the roads and all up the driveway here. And then they gave me the, I suppose, signal to open the school, because I'd prepared my speech the night before, and I said, with joy and thankfulness, I declare this school open, to be forever a school of freedom. And then there was great cheering and singing of the red flag and stuff. And I walked in, Mr. and Mrs. Higden behind me, and some of the Member of Parliaments, and then the railway men and all the rest. There we are.
And in this little building, the invincible Higdens continued to teach their village children for more than 20 years. The National Union of Teachers finally conquered its doubts and gave them funds on which to live. Tom Higden's work moved more and more to his Agricultural Workers' Union. Annie Higden continued indomitably to teach, and the new strike school became its own island of independence, with its own insistence on education, social justice and religion, and straight practical teaching.
Mrs. Higden used to bring her blankets to school for us to wash. And we used to use the copper. There's a wash house out there with a copper in. And we had soft water tanks outside. I don't know whether they're there now. And she used to bring her blankets. She never did use sheets. She slept in blankets, I think, winter and summer. She used to bring her blankets and let us elder children wash them for her. She said that would teach us laundry.
Violet helped with the infants, and so did Marjorie.
I used to teach these children, and she said to me, you are very, very good. You're getting them on with the reading, marvellous. And I did. And Tommy Potter in the village, he was only 7, but he was brilliant at reading. And the schoolmaster used to give him his Times newspaper and he used to read all the government topics.
To my mind, we we received a socialist education. I mean, I would say this was the main difference. For example, if we had what we called as children a Bible lesson, well then usually it turned round to the way that Christ sided always with the working class, against the property owners and the church at the time.
We had our little bit of religion at school each morning. We started school with a hymn, but they were different hymns, not the ordinary kind, you know. As I say, there was "When wilt thou save thy people, O God of mercy, when?" The people, Lord, the people, not thrones and crowns, but men.
The village was a poor one. Practically everybody was a farm worker. There was no other industry. Agriculture was the only industry. Farm workers' wages were 25 to 30 shillings a week at that time. And Mrs. Higden did actually pay my parents in order I could keep at school. Not being a recognised school, we were not allowed to enter for the grammar school exam at the old secondary school examination, and therefore I never got a chance to go to the secondary school. But she did pay my parents, I believe, 10 bob a week, so that I could stay on at school another year, and this I did.
My mother and father always declared that I was not going to domestic service, as that was the customary thing for girls in a village, and not if they had to work and keep me, they were not going to let me do that. But anyway, they didn't have to, because when I got to the strike school, Mrs. Higden suggested that I should learn shorthand and typing, and she presented me with the books and the typewriter, and I got going. She used to say to me, "Now you come up between 5 and 6 tomorrow morning," because I hated it. "And we'll do some speed practice." Of course, it's what we used to do.
The numbers at the strike school diminished naturally. New parents sometimes patronised the council school, the establishment school, but still the Higden school survived and endured. New children came from unexpected places.
At the time of the general strike, we had 6 miners' children lived in the village, were boarded by parents, and I believe their boarding fees were paid for by the Higdens. But they lived in the village for several months. This was at the time of the lockout of the miners following the general strike. They were from Bulwell Colliery in Nottinghamshire. And I can always remember them because that was the first experience that we in the village had of rickets. These children, these boys, all had rickets. And this was the result of malnutrition, I suppose.
So there were places worse off than Burston. Burston was now famous and stayed famous. Throughout the 20s and the early 30s, it was a great piece of symbolism for the left.
I've seen the village green covered with people. I mean, 1,000 people standing there. Always in the middle of the green, we'd have a maypole. I mean, this was on May Day. We celebrated May Day. May Day was International Labour Day, and we celebrated as a we never had our school holiday, but we celebrated as a high day. And on May Day, the girls used to dress the maypole, and I can see them now dancing around the maypole, weaving patterns on the maypole.
We had a terrific time. We danced and we sang, and everybody was so happy.
Yes.
We danced.
Win Leader and her husband remember that for the now elderly Tom Higden, May Day, Sunday, any day was the right day to spread his special gospel.
Tom Higden was a lay preacher, and he used to almost every Sunday find some chapel somewhere to take a service.
Well, he didn't actually find it, dear. They used to
invite him
and ask him to.
That's right.
To go.
And of course, Tom didn't hesitate to say that he used the chapel as a means of propaganda
in favour of his union and in favour of his political ideas, which were socialists.
They supported the agricultural labourers all along the line, and whenever there was a strike in some village of agricultural workers, Mr. and Mrs. Higden would take a few of us to this village, and we'd go and we'd talk to the labourers and sing to them, and of course all the labour things, you know.
By the mid-1930s, there were still about 20 Burston children going to Annie Higdon school, still being taught the truth as she saw it and not as she was told to see it, still battling on, well past retiring age, and still stubbornly refusing all offers of help.
So I believe the school would have still been a school today had the Higdens been a bit more compromising. I mean, I remember that teachers, several socialist teachers, would have liked to have taken over the school and to had it secured its future as a school.
One of the group who really wanted to see this Burston experiment continue was a London headmaster, Granville Giles.
Quite obvious that Mrs. Higden wasn't going to last forever. And we did find somebody who was willing to take it on, if we could work it. And I was deputed to go down and see Mrs. Higden and see if she could be persuaded to take this person into the school and later hand it over. I think I must have been 4 or 5 hours driving around the countryside in an old dog cart with her, and I don't think we really ever reached the real subject that I wanted to talk about.
This stubborn and indeed heroic old teacher wasn't going to surrender any hold on her achievements. She'd been the captain, and she was going to stick to the ship. In August 1939, 25 years after the Burston children had come out on their famous strike, Tom Higden died. And from all over the country, trade union leaders came to his funeral.
The coffin was brought to the strike school in a farm wagon, and my oldest brother, he was driving the horse, and they backed right up here. The body was brought in here, in this school. It wasn't taken in church, in here, and we had a little bit of, funeral service, and Mrs. Higden knelt down and she sang, "The Lord is my shepherd."
And she'd got a beautiful voice, lovely singer, and she sang and the expression on her face was terrible. You see, she idolised him.
They buried Tom Higden in Burston graveyard, so the church got that tough old radical at last. His wife Annie carried on with the strike school as long as she could, but it wasn't long. A few years later, she joined Tom in Burston graveyard. But the school is still there, the famous strike school. It's not a school anymore, it's used as a village hall. But it's more than either, really. It's a memorial to freedom.